They were beaten until their bones cracked and they weren't allowed to make a sound. In the city of Sparta, silence was not weakness, it was power. It was proof that the spirit had conquered the flesh, that discipline had triumphed over suffering. From the moment a Spartan child could walk, he was taught one lesson above all others. Pain is inevitable, but the way you face it defines who you are. While other Greek cities taught philosophy, art, or politics, Sparta taught endurance. Its schools were not filled with scrolls and scholars, but with stone floors, cold winds, and scars. The agoge, the Spartan training system, was not designed to educate, it was designed to break. Every boy entered it at the age of 7, stripped of comfort, family, and name, reduced to nothing, so that he could be rebuilt into something greater than himself. Inside those training grounds, pain was everywhere. It came from the hunger that gnawed at their stomachs, the blisters that tore at their feet, and the lashes of the whip that bit into their backs. But above all, it came from the silence that followed. No one cried, no one complained, no one was allowed to. They learned early that to cry out was to lose control, and control was sacred. The Spartans believed that the body belonged to the state, but the soul belonged to the man. And a man who could master his own suffering could master anything. At night, they slept on beds of reeds they had cut themselves, without blankets, even in winter. The cold was their first teacher, a merciless, honest one. It reminded them that comfort was not their right, and warmth was not a promise. When frost covered their skin, they did not shiver. They breathed slowly, quietly, letting their bodies adapt. Every heartbeat was an act of will. When food ran out, they didn't beg, they hunted. And when they failed to catch anything, they didn't starve, they learned. Hunger was not an enemy, it was a message. To survive, one must move, think, and fight smarter than the pain that chased him. The instructors, men who had survived the same torment, watched constantly. Their eyes were sharp, and their hands held rods made of wood and leather. If a boy flinched during training, he was struck again. If he cried out, he was humiliated. Pain was the tool by which they measured progress. The ones who suffered in silence earned respect. The ones who broke became lessons for others. There was a story told among the Spartans, one that every child grew up hearing. It spoke of a boy who once stole a fox from the fields to prove his cunning. When he was caught, he hid the animal under his cloak as the guards interrogated him. The fox, desperate to escape, clawed and tore at his belly, shredding his flesh, biting deep into his organs. But the boy stood still, eyes forward, face calm. He didn't scream, he didn't move. He let the fox devour him from within until he fell dead, still silent, his expression unbroken. For the Spartans, that story was not horror, it was glory. That boy became a symbol of what it meant to be one of them. To die quietly was greater than to live loudly, because silence, to them, was not emptiness. It was strength concentrated so tightly that even pain couldn't break it. The boys of the agoge learned to fight, to run, to endure, but more than anything, they learned to suffer. Their days were spent barefoot, their feet bleeding from sharp stones, their hands bruised from endless drills. They were beaten by their instructors, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. Pain was the sculptor, and they were the marble. And when one of them fell, there was no hand offered to help him rise. He had to rise on his own, or he would never rise again. The world outside Sparta called them savages, brutes without compassion or art. But within those stone walls, they were creating something no artist could carve: human beings shaped entirely from endurance. Every scar was a lesson, every bruise was a reminder. Every moment of silence was victory over the body. Their elders taught them that pain is honest, that it reveals who you are when there's nothing left to hide behind. Wealth can vanish, beauty fades, but pain strips a man to his essence, and what remains after that is either weakness or greatness. In Sparta, there was no room for the first. They learned to walk with broken toes, to train with split lips, to fight even when blood blurred their eyes. When the wounds grew deep, they did not ask for medicine. They packed them with dirt, tied them with cloth, and kept moving. To seek comfort was to betray discipline. To rest too long was to dishonor those who could not. Silence became their language. In the agoge, words were few, and every sound meant something. A grunt could mean failure. A cry could mean shame. But silence was triumph. It was proof that a boy was no longer a child, that he had crossed the invisible line between flesh and spirit. By the time they became men, their relationship with pain had changed. It was no longer something to resist, but something to command. Pain became the reminder that they were alive, that they still had something to give, that their purpose was not yet complete. When they stood in formation for battle, shoulder to shoulder beneath the crimson flags, that silence carried with it centuries of discipline. The same quiet they had learned as boys echoed across the fields of war. It was not the roar of the Spartans that terrified their enemies, it was the calm. Because calmness in the face of pain is the mark of men who have already conquered fear. And the Spartans, more than any people on earth, had turned that mastery into an art form. They didn't just fight pain, they became it. As the boys of the agoge grew into men, the lessons of pain did not fade away. They simply changed form. What had once been punishment became philosophy, and what had once been survival became devotion. The Spartans did not abandon their suffering when they reached adulthood, they perfected it. They understood that pain was not merely an obstacle to overcome, but a sacred teacher, one that stripped away pride, laziness, and hesitation until only purpose remained. To the outside world, their training seemed cruel beyond comprehension. But for the Spartans, cruelty was kindness in disguise, the kind that hardened flesh and sharpened will. When they endured lashings in the agoge, they did not cry because crying served no purpose. And when they bled in the training yard, they did not stop because stopping had no meaning. They carried this same mindset into adulthood, where pain was no longer forced upon them by instructors, but sought willingly as proof of their own worth. Every year, during the festival of Artemis Orthia, the young warriors participated in a ritual that would terrify any other people. Before the eyes of priests, elders, and citizens, the young men stood bare-chested at the altar of the goddess, while their backs were whipped with rods until the blood ran down their skin and soaked the earth below. The crowd did not look away, nor did the victims ask them to. This was not torture, it was ceremony, a sacred offering to discipline itself. The men who endured in silence were celebrated, and those who faltered were marked with eternal shame. It is said that some Spartans died during these rituals, collapsing before the altar with faces still calm, their lips unbroken by screams. To the spectators, it was not tragedy, it was transcendence. They believed that to die in silence was to die as a true Spartan, to offer not the body but the spirit as proof of absolute mastery. Even the mothers watched these ceremonies with pride, not horror. They had raised their sons for this very purpose, to prove that pain could be controlled, that flesh could be conquered by will. In those moments, the city was united by a single understanding, that silence was not absence, but dominance, the sound of the soul speaking louder than the body ever could. This same discipline carried on to the battlefield. When wounds tore through flesh and arrows pierced muscle, there was no panic. No wailing, no surrender. A Spartan did not measure bravery by victory or survival, but by the steadiness of his breath while dying. It was said that a Spartan's last words were never cries of pain, but reminders to his brothers to hold the line, to stay firm, to fight on. Pain, to them, was no longer physical. It had become an echo of something deeper, a test of how long the mind could command the body before it gave way to death. They believed that by mastering that balance, they could taste eternity even in their final heartbeat. Their relationship with pain shaped every part of Spartan life. When a soldier returned from war with scars, he did not hide them beneath his cloak. He wore them openly, not as wounds, but as symbols. Scars were not marks of suffering, they were proof that the man had stood face to face with agony and had refused to bow. Each cut was a story, each bruise a lesson, each broken bone a chapter in the silent language of endurance. Their stoicism was not emptiness, it was filled with meaning. The Spartans saw pain as something to be observed, not felt an event outside themselves, something that happened to the flesh but not to the spirit. They learned to breathe through agony, to detach from it, to look it in the eyes and remain still. Even their medical practices reflected this mindset. When a wound had to be stitched or a bone reset, the injured warrior did not shout. He gritted his teeth, stared ahead, and allowed the healer to work as if nothing were happening. Pain was not an enemy, it was a companion that tested his strength one last time. Their silence became legendary. Other Greeks told stories of Spartan warriors who continued fighting with arrows lodged in their legs or swords embedded in their sides, refusing to fall or speak of pain. They said that Spartan blood carried fire, that their hearts beat slower under suffering, that they could endure what would drive others mad. But the truth was simpler. It was not their blood that made them strong, but their belief that pain meant nothing if it did not control the will. In Sparta, to cry out in battle was not only seen as weakness, but as betrayal. The sound of pain could shake the man beside you, could break his focus, could shatter the unity of the phalanx. The silence of each warrior was not for himself, it was for the brother at his side. Every clenched jaw, every steady breath, every unbroken stare was an unspoken promise. "You can count on me, even when my flesh fails." That was why the Spartans feared no torture. When captured by enemies, they often met death with quiet smiles. They refused to give information, refused to plead, refused to scream, because they had been trained since birth to understand that control over one's voice was control over one's soul. Words could be taken, silence could not. There's a story told of a Spartan envoy captured by Persians during the wars. When brought before his executioners and asked for his final words, he simply said, "Make it quick." Then he looked them in the eye and stood tall, unflinching, as the blade fell. The Persians called it madness. The Spartans called it serenity. To the Spartan mind, pain was not an interruption of life. It was part of its rhythm. Just as rest prepared them for battle, suffering prepared them for greatness. They did not resist it or resent it, they welcomed it, knowing it revealed the boundaries of their strength and then pushed them beyond. And in this acceptance, they found a kind of peace that few have ever known. They did not waste energy in fear because they understood that what cannot be avoided should be embraced. They did not curse their suffering because it reminded them they were still alive. And they did not seek pity because to pity oneself was to surrender before the fight even began. Theirs was not the silence of emptiness, it was the silence of power. The kind of silence that can turn agony into clarity, chaos into control, and fear into purpose. The Spartans had learned that pain is only unbearable when it rules you. Once you learn to rule it, it becomes something else entirely, a form of freedom. And freedom, to them, was worth every scar. The silence of Sparta did not end on the battlefield. It lived on in the stories, in the statues, and in the hearts of those who tried to understand what kind of people could walk so calmly into pain and death without uttering a word. That silence became their signature, their hymn, their echo through history, a reminder that strength is not always loud, and that the greatest power often moves without a sound. When a Spartan returned home from war, his body often carried more scars than unbroken skin. Each mark told a story not of suffering, but of triumph. These men did not speak of their wounds, nor did they boast about their endurance. Words, after all, could never express what they had lived through. Instead, they let their silence speak for them. A glance, a movement, a breath all carried the weight of everything they had endured. Among the Spartans, there was an understanding that to talk about pain was to give it power. The less they spoke of it, the smaller it became. In that quiet acceptance, they transformed pain from an enemy into an ally. What others feared, they befriended. What others resisted, they absorbed. They understood that a man who no longer fights against his suffering ceases to be its prisoner. Their silence became a language that needed no translation. A wounded warrior who limped into the square was greeted not with pity, but with respect. No one asked how he had been hurt. They already knew the answer, because the answer was always the same: for Sparta. The mothers, too, carried that same stillness in their faces. When a messenger brought news that a son had died, they did not scream or fall to the ground. They stood tall, their eyes shining with grief and pride in equal measure. To cry was human, but to remain calm in the face of loss was divine. It was said that when one mother was told her son had died bravely in battle, she looked at the messenger and replied, "Then he has done well." That was the essence of Sparta: pain turned into purpose, loss turned into legacy, emotion refined into strength. This way of life was not built on cruelty, but on clarity. The Spartans did not seek pain for pleasure, they sought it for truth. They believed that only through pain could the mask of illusion be torn away, revealing what truly lay beneath. It was in suffering that a man met himself, stripped of pretense, stripped of weakness, face to face with the part of his soul that could not be broken. For them, there was no greater victory than that. Even in death, their silence endured. When Leonidas and his 300 men stood at Thermopylae, surrounded by a sea of Persian soldiers, they did not curse their fate or cry for mercy. They stood in perfect formation, shields locked, eyes forward, every muscle of their bodies tuned to a single purpose: to hold the line, no matter the cost. The Persians shouted, roared, and thundered across the pass. The Spartans answered not with noise, but with stillness. Their silence was more terrifying than any battle cry. It was the silence of men who had already accepted death and found peace within it. When arrows darkened the sky, they did not flinch. When the earth shook beneath the enemy's charge, they did not step back. And when the blades finally met, the air was filled not with screams, but with the rhythm of breath and steel, a harmony born from discipline. Many fell, but none broke. They fought until their strength was gone, and even then, they stood. The Persians who survived that day spoke of it in disbelief, of men who seemed made not of flesh and blood, but of stone and will. of warriors who died with calm faces and eyes open toward the horizon. In that silence, they achieved immortality. For centuries after, travelers who came to the site of the battle spoke of a strange feeling that lingered there, an energy, a presence, a weight in the air that could not be explained. They said that if you closed your eyes and stood still, you could almost hear it. Not the sound of war, but the echo of silence. The kind of silence that follows when men meet their end with dignity. And that was the final lesson the Spartans left to the world, that the true test of strength is not how loudly you fight, but how quietly you endure. Anyone can shout in courage when they believe they might survive, but only the truly fearless can remain silent when they know they will not. Generations later, philosophers tried to put into words what the Spartans had lived without speaking. They wrote about discipline, about control, about virtue born through struggle. Yet all their words were attempts to capture something that words themselves could never contain. The Spartans did not need to write. Their silence had already spoken across centuries. Their way of life was a paradox, harsh yet beautiful, cruel yet noble. They believed that pain revealed truth, and that truth was the foundation of freedom, because only a man who has conquered himself is truly free. And to conquer oneself, one must first learn to master pain. In that mastery, they found peace. The silence that surrounded them was not emptiness, it was fullness, the sound of men who had become complete. They needed no songs, no prayers, no praise. Their legacy was written in their endurance, carved into history by the strength of their will and the depth of their calm. The world remembers the Spartans for their wars, their discipline, their courage. But their greatest victory was invisible. It was the quiet victory over themselves. They taught that there is a kind of strength greater than muscle and sharper than steel. The strength to remain unmoved in the face of pain, to keep breathing when every nerve in your body begs you to scream, to find serenity in the heart of chaos. And perhaps that is why, even now, thousands of years later, their silence still speaks. It whispers to anyone willing to listen that the body can be broken, but the will cannot. That the world may take everything from you, your comfort, your peace, your life, yet it can never take your calm unless you surrender it. The Spartans never did. They endured every strike, every wound, every test without complaint, because they understood a truth that outlasted their empire, that suffering ends, but discipline remains. And in that silence, that unbreakable stillness that outlived the noise of war, they found eternity.